Okay, everybody, it is officially 12 o'clock, so let's begin, and we'll start with the recording. Welcome, everybody. Excited to see you all coming into class. I see all the hellos and good mornings in the chat, and it is a good morning. It is almost afternoon for some of us, but we're excited to see you all. My name is Carrie Sutner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer here at the Constitution Center, and today's class is all about the First Amendment, and we're going to look at the two religion clauses. So to help us guide through all this cool content, all these amazing stories, we're here with one of our top scholars, Tom Donnelly. So Tom, how excited are you for these two big clauses today?
Very excited, daunting challenge.
We can do it, we always can. So 30 minutes, people, ask lots of questions and we'll weave them in. And we always start with questions that we have for Tom, questions we have on the topic. And always we like to begin with, what is the Establishment Clause? What is the Free Exercise Clause? Those two big religion clauses. But why did they put it in the Constitution in the first place? So Tom, maybe we start there and then we can dive into looking at the words of the First Amendment and pull out these clauses. But what was the kind of energy around not just putting one clause, but two clauses about religion in the First Amendment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Craig. I mean, in part, it is a concern with the government being too entangled with people's religious beliefs. We'll get into the history in a second, but part of America is born of religious dissenters fleeing religious oppression. And so for the founding generation, but also for the colonists before them, they cared a lot about these issues. And so they really worked hard to make sure that they were written into the Constitution when we put together the Bill of Rights.
And that is such an important thing to remember. There was Native American people here when the colonists came over. The colonists came over for a reason, and it was to have some of these freedoms. So they wanted to make sure it was in the Constitution. So I'll turn you back over to this First Amendment, kind of unpack those two religion clauses. What do they mean? And in our worksheets for the students that we sent out, we said, write 3 words that summarizes each clause. So just see if you can do that, Tom.
I don't know if I can do that, but let's begin with the text like we always like to. So here's the key language. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. We call that the Establishment Clause. And then that next part is or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We call that the Free Exercise Clause. And so these two clauses are two ways of getting at the big idea being religious liberty in America. And so for the Establishment Clause, that was fundamentally all about banning government from establishing or creating a religion in America. So that's why we don't have an official religion of the United States. Other countries do, we don't. In part, this was a way for the founding generation to say, as we're establishing this new, more powerful national government, we don't want you in the religion business. So that's the Establishment Clause. The Free Exercise Clause goes importantly to our belief in freedom of worship. So it gives us all the right to worship God or not as we would like without government interfering with our religious beliefs. And so if you put these two things together, they're really at the core, Curry, of our freedom of conscience. This idea that we're able to freely believe as we wish or not.
And I love that. I love that kind of or not, because that's what we tend to forget when we talk about those two clauses. When we talk about the Establishment Clause or the Free Exercise Clause, it is about, the government not getting in the weeds and in your business so you can have your free exercise or choose not to. So free exercise, establishment, and that they're a part of that larger umbrella of the First Amendment. You're allowed to think, talk, express yourself, believe in what you choose to believe in. That whole shebang is freedom of conscience. But there's a lot in how we define the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So we're going to kind of bifurcate it a little bit, but let's begin with what you led us with in the beginning is people were coming to the North America looking for freedom of religion, looking for the ability to have that freedom of conscience. So give us a little bit of kind of a lead in, and then we'll bifurcate and go through clause by clause and what it's really about.
Yeah, what's so fun about exploring the past often, Curry, is it really feels like an entirely different universe. And this is certainly true of the story of religion in the United States. And it points in a few different directions. We can see how they end up relating to the clauses in the Constitution. So one thing to note about America, I said it at the beginning, is that we were born of people fleeing religious oppression. And so because of that, if you were to go state by state throughout the colonies, you would see great religious diversity. So we had Puritans in New England, Anglicans, the Church of England, all throughout the South, Quakers and Lutherans in Pennsylvania, Roman Catholics in Maryland, Presbyterians in the middle colonies, and we had Jewish segregations from Newport, Rhode Island, all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. So one part of the American religious tradition is this religious diversity. But the other part is, as we go into colonial America, we also see established churches in the colonies. And so we see an established church, the Church of England, established all throughout the southern United States. We see big established Puritan congregations up in Massachusetts. And you know what does it mean to have an established church? What does that look like? Well, colonial officials will have a say in who gets a license to preach, who can be a clergy member. Colonies will require everyone, whether you believe or not, to pay religious taxes, to attend church services. And you know what? If you're a religious dissenter, if you want to preach without a license, you could be punished. You could be banished from the colony. This is what happens to Roger Williams in 1636. He's in Massachusetts. He has some disagreements with the Puritan establishment, and they say, okay, that's nice, Roger. Leave. Go into the wilderness. See how well you do. It's pretty dangerous out there. Now, Roger Williams himself would go on to establish Rhode Island, but plenty of other people were banished from the colonies and didn't fare so well. And so we have these twin things, this religious diversity on the one hand, established churches on the other. Well, we already have also a tradition of non-establishment in other states as we move along. And so there are states that didn't have established churches, like Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, much of New York. And so as we're looking at the clauses that we read at the beginning of class, if you look at the Establishment Clause, what is that about? Well, the founding generation, the Establishment Clause is really about making sure the national government can't establish a national church. We're a religiously diverse people. We don't want the national government doing that. The flip side, though, is that the states also didn't want the national government to have the power to disestablish their official churches either. And so there's a way in which the Establishment Clause, as originally written, is all about federalism. It's all about the powers that go to the national government versus the powers that go to the state. And it's specifically about limiting the powers of the national government. So that's a bit about the Establishment Clause and the story leading up to it, Curry.
And that's really helpful. And one of Elizabeth, in the chat, one of our students also shared, Elizabeth did share Anne Hutchinson, which is another example. Yeah, that was
just like the Roger Williams story. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and it didn't fare so well. I think kind of goes to that nod of, this is a hard time, hard life, and having that community around you was so unbelievably protective. So then fighting and saying, I'm leaving because you're doing this wrong and I should be able to have my own beliefs is really unbelievably important. So great kind of layout and setup and understanding. And you, Mandy asked a great question in the Q&A, is there have been times when the Supreme Court, SCOTUS, has stated that the U.S. is a Christian nation. How do the courts square away with this and the Bill of Rights? And I think we begin that conversation and looking into that by talking about who are they talking about in the First Amendment? They're talking about the national government. So what can happen at the national government is different than what can happen at the state level. And we really have to say that is a big difference over time. So diving in, as I need my water, into the Establishment Clause, you want to talk a little bit about what it sets up, and then maybe jump into the lemon test, and then we'll go to free exercise next.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question about, keeping in mind, what can the national government do? What can the states do? And, just to tee that off at the beginning, what we'll say is that it's from the 1940s onward where the Supreme Court ends up applying the key protections for religious liberty against state abuses. So before then, the First Amendment's really only applying to the national government. But from the 1940s onward, the courts then say, no, those Bill of Rights protections, they extend against the states. This is called incorporation. It's when the Bill of Rights becomes truly a charter of national freedom. But it's fairly late. The 1940s is pretty far along in our constitutional history. So just keep that in mind for what, yeah, sorry, Carrie.
Oh, no, I think it was great. I was just going to give you the opportunity when you talk about incorporation. What's the big amendment that makes the Bill of Rights stick to the states and stick to the individuals, just to name it for our students?
It's the 14th Amendment ratified in 1868 after the Civil War and written by John Bingham, who's sitting behind me.
You know, always give Tom an opportunity. But I think it's really important. I think that the 1868, the 14th Amendment said, you know, the rights of the Bill of Rights, in other words, but apply to you. 1940 is when the courts start to incorporate the religion clauses. So diving into that, we talk so often in our country about separation of church and state. And it's not so clean like the graphics like to make it seem. So can you help us kind of understand where is this balance between establishing a religion? Clearly, you know, the government can't establish a church. That's pretty straightforward. But where is this kind of blend, and where does it get tricky? And how do we almost put like a rubric or a test on it to say this is when it clears it, this is when it's, you know, not okay?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court will be the first ones to tell you it's really, really hard. And they've struggled with coming up with tests in this context. But yeah, so the Establishment Clause, by 1833, all of the states have gotten rid of their established religions. So we have no official established religion anywhere in the United States. And so the question is, then what is this clause doing? What is its purpose after that? And what we know is that over time, cases involving the Establishment Clause are some of the most controversial in front of the Supreme Court. These are cases dealing with school prayer, dealing with nativity scenes and Ten Commandment displays on government property, on crosses, large crosses on government property, funding of schools. These are really, really big, hard questions that scholars and justices alike disagree about. Now, there's some easy cases, Curry. Let's remember the Establishment Clause is in there in part to make sure and make it extra clear. Government can't tell you who your clergy is going to be, what your religion has to believe, what members of your faith have to believe, you know, how your actual religion is going to be structured. So there is an autonomy there for religious organizations. But also what it tells us is that, you know, government and scholars across the board would agree with this. The government can't just give some money to one religion, but not to the other, unless there's a good non-religious reason for that. So there are ways in which there is consensus broadly around certain key points when it comes to the Establishment Clause. But as we tick through the cases that end up as live debates before the Supreme Court, these are the sorts of cases that result in dissents and those opinions by other justices saying, no, the Supreme Court got this one wrong. And it's not an area where we see a lot of consensus across the board. So should we tick through the three big areas here? Government funding, government-sponsored prayer, and religious symbols?
Let's go.
Excellent. Actually, Curry, you got me on the right track and I got off of it, where the big test the Supreme Court has articulated for the Establishment Clause is known as the Lemon Test. It's from 1971. I almost forgot about it because virtually every justice seems to want to get rid of it, and they rarely want to apply it. But I actually think the test itself gets a bit at sort of the sensibility the court uses when it's approaching these cases. So the Lemon Test tells us when we have a challenge to a law that people say is favoring religion in some way, we have to ask these three questions. Does the law have a secular legislative purpose? So is there a non-religious purpose for this law? Two, its principle or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. So it's got to be kind of neutral as to religion. And the statute must not foster an excessive entanglement with religion. So we don't really want government getting all involved in a religion's business. But this is sort of the three-step Lemon Test. It's still good law. It has never been overturned, but the Supreme Court often seems to try to go out of its way to not apply it. So it ends up, as a practical matter, for a scholar to be an absolute mess sometimes when you look at these cases. But that's the Lemon Test. You should know it. We'll put it on the table. But let's go to these government funding cases, Curry. Let's see, what do they have to do with? So these are situations where we have religious schools, other activities that are conducted by religious organizations. And the question is, can government funding flow into these religious organizations? And so scholars and justices alike disagree on how to read the Establishment Clause in this context. One set of scholars and justices say, what's required here is that we have to treat the religious organizations no better or no worse than other organizations. This is an approach of neutrality that you find in these situations. And so, these scholars and justices are more open to some government funding coming into religious organizations, and they're really requiring neutrality. The other group here disagrees, and they say, it's very dangerous to have government money flowing into religious organizations. You might favor some religious organizations over others. There are all sorts of problems with this. And so we really need a bright line rule. And the bright line rule that they usually go to is if any of this money is going to be used in any way to advance a religious purpose, then that money should not flow into this organization. So it's a bright line rule. And the effect there is that less money is going to flow to religious organizations. What we've seen over time, Curry, at the Supreme Court is that the court initially followed that first approach, that neutrality, so allowing some money to flow into schools. In the 70s and 80s, it flowed away from that and moved towards a bright line rule saying, really, we don't want government funding in this context. And then finally, what we've seen in the last 10 years or so, I'd say, is the Supreme Court flowing more back into that first category, requiring neutrality towards religion. A classic example would be something a state government puts forth a program saying, we're going to give some money to daycares to install protective protective matting in their playgrounds. Should religious organizations be able to have access to those funds? The Supreme Court says yes. Yes, they should. That does not violate the Establishment Clause. There's no, there's sort of, anyway, so that's sort of how those are approached by the Supreme Court today.
Yeah, and I think some of the COVID CARES acts that were happening in states was also another example that there was support to help students with meals that could go home. And that was equal across all schools and not just for one school or the other, because it was helping the kids and not directly connected to teaching a religion or not. I always like the bus example too, if the kids can need support to get to school. As we think about this, and we're going to dive into the next category, which is government-sponsored prayer. And this leads us down some great stories and some interesting stories. But along this, I want to bring in one of Elizabeth's questions around, but how come the coins that I pick up say, "In God we trust," if the government is not, getting into religion, says you can have a religion or you don't have to have one at all, that's your choice. They're almost, by you saying that, they're like siding with the religion. So kind of marrying them together a little bit as you dive into this next topic.
Yeah, I mean, the other example is under God and the Pledge of Allegiance. So both in God we trust and under God, if I remember correctly, they were put in place in the context of the 1950s in the fight against communism. But yeah, I think the school prayer cases are the perfect way to answer that question. So what we see with the Supreme Court and the Establishment Clause is, in many ways, its most famous set of cases were cases like Engel versus Vitale, Abington School District versus Schempp, where the court held that it's unconstitutional for public schools to require prayer or even have prayer on a voluntary basis inside the schools. And so these were really important, really controversial cases before the Supreme Court. You saw huge public backlash against them. You saw a push in Congress to propose constitutional amendments to overturn them. But ultimately, the Supreme Court held its ground. And it even went on to expand this line of cases, into the context of school graduation ceremonies in a case called Lee versus Weissman in 1992, and at football games in a case called Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe. And so with here, a lot of what seems to be animating the court in this context is the context of the school itself and the age and vulnerability of children. And so what's animating the decisions here is a concern about the coercion of children, coercion of children around religion in this context. And so that's sort of the line of cases that deal with prayer in public schools. But the flip side, and this goes to the question about in God we trust, or in particular, is that there are also a range of cases in the context involving adults where the court has generally said, no, prayer is okay in this context. And so an example would be legislative prayer, a case like Marsh versus Chambers. And in the case of a town council prayer in Town of Greason versus Galloway just a few years ago. And here what the court seems to be saying is, in the schools we're concerned about coercion, but with adults, the rules can be a little different. The other thing to note here is, as the court's reasoning through these cases, part of what they seem to rely on too is we're not going to disrupt a long-standing tradition absent a really good reason. And so you see a majority of the justices, even some of the progressive justices in some cases, saying, we're going to look at history, we're going to look at tradition. If this is something that's happened a really long time ago, in the case of legislative prayer, something that goes all the way back to the founding itself, unless we see really, really bad instances of religious discrimination or something like that, we're going to let those practices stand.
And I always found that interesting, and we can kind of roll in really quickly to the endorsement test on that. Like, where does where's the line drawn? Because we're always looking for where the boundaries on these boxes are. But when we think about in God, like the Pledges of Allegiance and In God We Trust, and it was like 1952, 54 that they were adding in. What makes tradition? How long do you have to be in the system? That's what I always question on that one. It's the 50s tradition, 50 years ago, or is it longer or shorter than that? And maybe it's more of a sense of tradition than an actual number. But maybe, yeah, and I think that's what it is. But as we dive into this, we have two real quick questions before we end this section and jump into free exercise. But can you just go over the endorsement test real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing to note is that on these questions, you will see scholars disagree with the Supreme Court and dissenting justices disagree. So this is not, it's an area of ripe debate. The last set of cases, and this goes to the endorsement test, has to do with government, has to do with religious symbols on government property. And again, these are things like nativity scenes on government land, large commemorative crosses for the war dead on government land, things like Ten Commandment displays. And in these contexts, what the court tends to do is it tends to ask sort of we call it the endorsement test, but it's sort of asking the common sense question that, if a reasonable observer knew the full context here, would they describe what's going on as government endorsing religion? And therefore, if government does endorse religion, do you think it will send a message of discouragement to other believers and non-believers? And so again, the cases turn on really the facts in a lot of these cases. So Lynch versus Donnelly in 1984 involved a nativity scene in a shopping district around other religious displays. And the court said, no, that's okay. It engenders a friendly community spirit of goodwill in keeping with the season. Another case involved a nativity scene at the top of a courthouse stairway. It was County of Allegheny versus ACLU in 1989. And the court said, no, that's sectarian. That looks too much like the endorsement of religion. And then in 2005, Curry, we actually had two cases come out on the same day that came out in different ways, where in the one hand, a 10 Commandment display in a courthouse in McCreary County versus ACLU, the court said that's unconstitutional, but a 10 Commandments display on the state capitol grounds among a bunch of other monuments being donated to the state by a secular organization, the court said that is constitutional. So again, these can be a little confusing, fact specific, and the court, to a certain extent, at least the justices who have proven decisive in these cases, have tried to look at it, I think, from their own perspective, as like a pragmatic, common sense way, which a lot of people find unsatisfying.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I think just going back to, these are some of the most heated cases, or not heated, but split cases that we've seen. There's a lot of 5-4s in these cases, and that they're still being decided today and still being grappled with today. Two questions from the group. One question, I think Mandy asked it about, is there some way that school choice, so school choice is the option where a parent can say, oh, you're going to spend $500 on a school for my kid. I want to take that stipend of money and use it to any school I want. In some ways, could school choice be considered against this endorsement clause? And could it be saying that by the government giving the parent money and the parent uses it at a Catholic school or a Jewish school, that it's endorsing that religion? That was one question around this. And the second question is about Florida governor signed a bill requiring public schools to set aside at least 1 minute of silence for children to meditate, pray, or do anything. Is this legal because it is not promoting one prayer over another? So real quick at you, and then we'll jump to free exercise. This is fun class.
Yeah, the school choice one's a great question. It's actually a live question before the court this term in a case called Carson versus Macon. There, Maine has provided funds for parents to be used at private schools. And what the state has said is, the money can go to private schools that don't have a religious purpose, but they can't go to religious schools. And the Supreme Court has to decide whether or not that violates the First Amendment. And so the court has gone back and forth on these questions, but you're precisely right. That definitely falls within the category of those school funding cases. And the justices tend to disagree over, which one works in that context. The Florida governor, I had not read that news. I didn't know that one. But the point is that you're analyzing it in precisely the right way. What the court's going to ask is, effectively, is this really just school prayer by another name? And therefore, does it run afoul of the school prayer cases? Or is this different enough because it's not a specifically religious prayer? You're allowing people to meditate or do whatever they want during that period. Is that different enough from those classic school prayer cases that it does not feel coercive. And that's what the courts are going to have to ask themselves.
And that's interesting, too, to layer on what you taught us earlier, is to say that could be different for a moment of silence in an adult setting that's government related than it is a school. So they'll analyze it with even more scrutiny around that, too. So, okay. So we're putting all the pieces together. This is going to be a super fun court session at the end of this year, too, to look at the two cases. Okay. Preexercise clause. So what does that mean? And how have we seen the courts come down? And these are lots of split decisions too. Walk us through. And you've got like 5 minutes. You can do it, Tim.
That's plenty. That's plenty. So here's the key text. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. And this is really going to our own freedom to believe as we'd like. And so when the first Congress and James Madison are putting together the First Amendment, this is one of the key rights that was in so many of the state constitutions that existed at the time. So it was deeply embedded in the American constitutional tradition by that point. And so what do these kind of cases look like? Like, what do these challenges look like? How are they different than the ones we just heard? Well, usually what it involves is the government's going to pass a law that applies to everyone. So say something like certain drugs are illegal. Polygamy, marrying more than one person, that's illegal. Things that are generally applied laws that apply to everyone's conduct. And then you're going to have a religious group or a religious objector come in and say, wait a minute, that law runs right against something that I'm required to do through my religion. And they will argue that violates the First Amendment's free exercise clause. And so these cases tend to pit laws that apply to everyone against objections by religious people. And the court has to decide, when does the will of the majority prevail? When does the government prevail? Or when should religious objectors be able to not have the law apply to a particular form of conduct they have? And so when the court has looked at this question over time, they've distinguished between religious belief and religious conduct or action. And so what they say under the free exercise clause, our freedom of belief is absolute. We can't control what we believe in many ways. It is the most fundamental of all natural rights. And because of that, government cannot interfere with belief. Here's the key quote from Cantwell versus Connecticut. The clause embraces two concepts, freedom to believe and the freedom to act. The first is absolute, but in the nature of things, the second cannot be. And so this is the idea of at a certain point, the government has to be able to pass laws to promote the health, safety, and welfare of the people living in this country. And because of that, sometimes those things are going to run up against the faith of believers. And over time, the Supreme Court has sort of gone back and forth with the question of when the government should prevail and when the religious objector should prevail. I mean, the first example is a case called Reynolds versus United States in 1878. So it's the late 1800s. It involves the Mormon Church. And the national government is passing a law saying that polygamy, marrying more than one person, is illegal. The Mormons argue, no, polygamy is actually central to our faith. The government can't do this. This violates our First Amendment free exercise rights. And what the Supreme Court says in an opinion by Chief Justice Morrison Wade is, no, George Reynolds, Mormon Church, you're wrong. The government has an interest in banning polygamy. You may have these beliefs that you may want to conduct this particular behavior, but in the end, you, the religious objector, lose. Here are a couple of key quotes that really get at the court's reasoning. Laws are made for the government of actions, and while they cannot interfere with mere religious belief and opinions, they may with practices. So we can't mess with your beliefs, but we can sometimes ban certain of your practices. And then the court warned that if they ruled otherwise in cases like Reynolds, that, quote, it would be to make the professed doctrines of religious belief superior to the law of the land and in effect permit every citizen to become a law unto himself. And so the concern is you can just, for people who are insincere, they could just invent religious faiths and then challenge the laws. And how is the court going to decide which is sincere belief and which is not? So that's Reynolds versus United States. Then the court sort of kept this similar approach under Reynolds all the way up until the 1960s and 70s. But at that point, the court is expanding rights protections across a lot of the Bill of Rights. And this is consistent too with how it approached the Free Exercise Clause. There's a case called Sherbert versus Werner, which involved a worker who was a Seventh-day Adventist church member who quit her job rather than work on her Sabbath, which was on Saturday. The state then denied her unemployment benefits, and she argued, how can the government deny me benefits if I'm quitting because of my religious faith? And so she's a religious objector, and the Supreme Court sides with her. They say, Sherbert, you are absolutely right in this context. The government needs a really, 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 really good reason to not give you unemployment benefits, and it doesn't have that reason. So that's Sherbert versus Werner in 1963. You can hop in, Carrie. I'm sorry, I've talked.
Yeah, I just wanted to make it clear, like there have been times where laws have been written in states that target certain religious groups, and they're written in a way to kind of combat them. And when they're brought to the court says, no, you're not doing what we said you could do with the free exercise clause. You're not making a general rule, and you're really targeting this religious group. And when you do that, we will take away that law. So there have been that times we talk a little bit about, like, you would be able to make any religion you want and say, like, I have, a never have to eat Brussels sprouts religion and never have to eat it. But it kind of went both ways in our past, correct?
Correct. I would say if you're looking across all of American constitutional history, the government has won more than religious objectors have. But there are cases like Sherbert versus Werner we talked about. Another famous one, Wisconsin versus Yoder from 1972, involving Amish families that didn't want their kids to have to go to school after the age of 14. So it's challenging a Wisconsin law that requires students to go to school through high school. The Amish families argue, no. Once you get into high school, you learn all sorts of worldly values that run up against our faith. And frankly, for our children, we're part of a close-knit community. They're going to be great citizens. They're going to be able to succeed. They're not going to be harmed by not attending high school. So this law by Wisconsin requiring them to go to school violates the free exercise clause. And they won too. The Supreme Court sides with the Amish families. But after Yoder, as we get into the 80s and 90s, the Supreme Court sort of turned away from a protective approach to free exercise challenges. The classic case, Curry, is Employment Division versus Smith in 1990. And this one sounds a lot like Sherbert versus Werner. It involves Native Americans who are working. They use peyote, a hallucinogenic drug that's illegal, as part of their religious ceremonies. They fail a drug test in Oregon. They lose their jobs. And then the state says, no, we are not going to give you unemployment benefits because you violated our drug laws. And so they come to the Supreme Court and they say, this is Sherbert versus Werner. We should win under the First Amendment's free exercise clause. We should get these unemployment benefits. And the court says no. In an opinion by Justice Antonin Scalia, largely mirroring Reynolds versus United States, saying we have this generally applicable law. The government has a clear interest in getting rid of illegal drugs. You may have some objections, but this is not something that's targeting a religion. It's for the public good of everyone. If you want exemptions from these drug laws, do what plenty of other groups have done over time. Go to the political branches, try to get them to write an exception for you into the law. And so that's what we see in Employment Division versus Smith, is a law that's really an approach to these cases that's really, really good for the government, not great for religious objectors. The coda here, Curry, is exactly what you're saying. Is that the Supreme Court then shortly thereafter ends up writing a really strong anti-discrimination rule into the free exercise clause in 1993. So shortly after Employment Division versus Smith, the case is Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah. It involves people of the Santeria faith. Part of their rituals involves animal sacrifice. So the Santeria relocate to the city of Hialeah in Florida. The people of the city of Hialeah don't like that the Santeria have relocated into this town. And so they very quickly pass a law saying, no, we're getting rid of animal sacrifice in the context of religious ceremonies. We're writing out exceptions for kosher butchering or other butchering of animals. We're basically writing this law that really, if you read the law, seems to pretty clearly be targeting the Santeria faith. The question for the court was, under Smith, will the Santeria win? Will the religious objector win in this context? And what the Supreme Court says is, yes, the religious objector wins. The Santerians win. This is an instance where it's not a general law applying to everyone. This is the city of Hialeah saying, you are not welcome here because of your religious beliefs. That's religious discrimination. If they want to do that, they need the strongest possible justification of the law. They need a really, 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 really good reason to pass a law like this. They didn't have it. And as a result of that, under the free exercise clause, there is this strong anti-discrimination principle that, you could see applying in a variety of contexts, including some of those challenges to COVID regulations that you've seen in the last couple of years have involved very much this, where the majority of the court has looked at some of them and said, you're treating religious groups worse than you're treating businesses. And because of that, that violates the free exercise clause. Now, there's dissenters who disagree. And like a lot of these cases, there are strong opinions on each side, but that's how this particular case and this particular rule has applied even in the context all the way up until today.
Awesome. Thank you for kind of wrapping that all in there and understanding what, when laws are written, what's their purpose, and how they affect people, what is the resources that religions can have to push back, and where will they move and where will they not. So that was really absolutely helpful to understand all these pieces and to really think back about what is the purpose of the First Amendment, understanding that religion is a big part of this ability to believe what you choose to believe or not, and how does it really play out in establishment free exercise, and how the courts have grappled with this over time, but really not that long, since the 1940s, and that's a big memory too. So thank you so much, Tom. This is a great class. Any kind of final words?
Yeah, I was going to say the last thing to note, and I said at the beginning, is this is an area of the law that's hotly contested. It's moving really quickly. If there's any general trend at the court, it's in strengthening the religion clauses. And we even see some justices today, many of them saying, not only do we need to reconsider the Lemon Test, but we need to reconsider employment division versus Smith as well. And so this is just an area to watch, both because it's so important, but because it's a really fast moving area of the law right now to see what direction the court's going to move in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. Students, everybody have a great afternoon. I'm going to pause the recording and stop the share and see just in case. Let me stop this live stream. Sorry, I can't do anything today without saying it out loud.